Every backyard gardener who has ever grown tomatoes has had the same experience at least once. You put the plant in the ground in spring. You water it faithfully. You watch it grow and grow and grow into one of the most impressively lush, green, sprawling plants in your entire garden. And then the season ends, and you pick a handful of tomatoes that a single grocery store vine could have outproduced. All that growth, all that care, and almost nothing to show for it in the fruit basket. The problem is not that you failed as a gardener. The problem is that your tomato plant succeeded at exactly the wrong thing. It grew leaves instead of tomatoes, and nobody told you that those two outcomes are in direct competition with each other, and that you have to choose which one wins. The reason nobody told you this is partly that it is counterintuitive. A plant covered in lush, dark green foliage looks healthy, and we have been conditioned to associate that appearance with success. A tomato plant that has been pruned severely, that has bare stretches of stem and relatively few leaves compared to an unpruned neighbor, can look alarming to someone who has not seen this method before. It looks like something went wrong. But the plants that look slightly severe in late June are the same plants that are hanging so heavily with fruit in August that they need dedicated structural support to stay upright. Understanding why requires understanding how a tomato plant makes its decisions about where to put its energy. And once you see that clearly, you will never look at an unpruned tomato the same way again. That is what this video is about. I am going to walk you through the complete method I use to grow a genuinely heavy harvest of tomatoes in a small growing space. And I am going to cover every part of it, from the first decision you make at the plant nursery all the way through to the secret ingredient that makes your tomatoes taste noticeably sweeter than anything your neighbor is growing. There is one technique in the middle of this video that most backyard gardeners have never heard of, and when I show it to you, it is going to change how you look at every tomato plant you ever grow from this point forward. Stay with me through the whole thing, because the aspirin trick near the end is the part that genuinely surprises people the most, and the science behind it is worth understanding before you apply it. Before we dive in, I have a major announcement. The gardening guide you have been writing to me about for months is finally here. The Plant Once Garden is officially out. It is roughly 150 pages of everything this channel teaches, with a hand-drawn heritage cover and warm cream pages that feel like your grandmother's own gardening guide. Inside, 90 perennials that come back every year with almost no labor, 6 garden plans, the planting calendar, and the hydrogen peroxide method explained completely. Scan the QR code on your screen now, or click the link in the pinned comment or description below to get your copy. Thank you for your patience. Now, back to the garden. Before you touch a pair of pruning shears, before you drive a single stake into the ground, there is one question you need to answer about the tomato plant in front of you, because the answer determines everything else about how you are going to manage it. Is it determinate or indeterminate? Determinate tomatoes are bush-type plants. They grow to a predetermined size, set all their fruit within a relatively short window of time, and then they are done for the season. These are compact, self-limiting plants, and that self-limiting nature is precisely the point. If you buy a determinate variety and then start aggressively cutting off growth to train it vertically, you are not improving its productivity. You are removing the very branches that were going to produce your harvest. Do not prune determinate tomatoes heavily. Let them do what they were bred to do. Indeterminate tomatoes are an entirely different conversation, and this entire guide is built around them. Indeterminate varieties are vining plants. They do not stop at a fixed size. Left to their own devices, they will keep growing, keep flowering, and keep setting fruit continuously from early summer straight through until the first hard frost shuts them down. This sounds like the ideal situation, and in some ways it is. An indeterminate tomato is theoretically capable of producing fruit for your table for the entire season. But that continuous growth potential comes with a serious management challenge, and it is the same challenge that trips up the majority of backyard gardeners every single year. Without intervention, an indeterminate tomato plant does not direct its energy primarily toward fruit. It directs its energy primarily toward creating more plant, more leaves, more stems, more bulk, and more shade. Because from the plant's biological perspective, a massive leaf canopy is a survival advantage. The plant does not know you want tomatoes. It only knows that more photosynthetic surface area means more energy and more reproductive capacity. Your job, as the gardener, is to override that default behavior and redirect that energy specifically toward the fruit that you actually want. The tool you use to override that default behavior is called the single stem method, and it is the structural foundation of everything else in this guide. The concept is straightforward. Instead of allowing the plant to branch outward in multiple directions and create a tangled, dense, sprawling canopy, you train it to grow straight up along one single vertical main stem. One vine, going up, producing fruit clusters along the way, managed so tightly that you can grow multiple plants in a row with surprisingly little horizontal space between them. The immediate advantages of this approach are practical and significant. A vertically trained single-stem plant takes up a fraction of the garden space that an unpruned, caged, or sprawling plant demands. You can fit more plants in the same footprint and get a larger total harvest from a smaller area. The fruit is easier to see and pick because it is hanging off a vertical structure rather than buried inside a dense thicket of leaves. The plant receives better light penetration and better airflow throughout the entire canopy, both of which meaningfully reduce disease pressure. And perhaps most importantly for the actual tomatoes on your plate, the plant's energy is concentrated into the fruit clusters it is already producing, rather than diluted across dozens of new stems and thousands of new leaves that contribute almost nothing to your harvest weight. The mechanism that makes this method work is called sucker removal, and this is the skill that separates the gardener who gets a handful of tomatoes from the one who fills baskets. Here is exactly what to look for. Find the main vertical stem of your plant. Now find any horizontal leaf branch coming off that stem, right in the crotch of the V where those two meet. Where the main stem and the leaf branch form their junction, you will see a tiny new shoot emerging at approximately a 45-degree angle. That shoot is a sucker, and it is one of the most important things to understand about how tomato plants grow. A sucker looks harmless at first. It is just a small shoot, sometimes barely an inch long, easy to miss if you are not specifically looking for it. But if you leave that sucker alone and come back a week or two later, you will find that it has grown into a full secondary stem with its own leaf branches, its own flower clusters, and its own set of new suckers forming in each of its own leaf branch junctions. Left entirely unchecked, a single missed sucker can develop into a growth of equal size to your original main stem within a few weeks, effectively doubling the structural complexity of the plant and having the energy available for the fruit clusters that were already developing. This is how a tomato plant that starts as a single orderly vine becomes the impenetrable green wall that most backyard gardeners recognize from their own gardens by mid-July. The management routine is simple once you understand what you are looking for. Walk through your tomato bed at least once a week, preferably twice during the peak of the growing season. Inspect every leaf branch junction on every plant. When you find a sucker, and you will find them every single time, pinch it off cleanly with your fingers while it is still small and tender, ideally before it reaches 2 inches in length. Small suckers snap off cleanly and leave minimal wound surface on the stem. If you let them grow larger before catching them, use clean, sharp shears to cut them off, rather than tearing them, which can create ragged wounds that invite disease. The rule is simple. Find them early, remove them consistently, and the plant stays in the shape you want it in. A question I hear constantly from gardeners trying this for the first time is whether it is possible to accidentally remove a leaf branch that is not a sucker. The honest answer is yes, but the confusion typically clears up quickly with practice. The key distinction is angle and origin. A leaf branch emerges from the main stem and grows predominantly horizontally outward. A sucker emerges from the junction between a leaf branch and the main stem at roughly a 45-degree diagonal angle, and it is growing into the empty V-shaped space between them rather than straight out from the stem. Once you have found and removed a few of them, you develop an eye for that characteristic diagonal emergence and the junction point it always originates from. After a week or two of consistent practice, you will spot them instantly without needing to study each junction carefully. Every reliable system has legitimate exceptions, and the single-stem method has 2 specific situations where you should deviate from the strict rule of removing every sucker. Understanding these exceptions matters because applying the rule rigidly when one of these situations applies will actually cost you productivity rather than improve it. The first exception is the two-stem split. If you have more horizontal space available in your garden than a pure single-stem layout requires, and you want to increase the fruit output of a single plant without simply adding another plant to the row, you can choose to retain one strong sucker emerging near the base of the main stem and allow it to develop into a second vertical main stem. You now have a plant growing in a V-shape, two parallel vertical stems both trained upward, each producing its own fruit clusters, managed identically to a single stem. This approach gives you the production of nearly two plants from a single root system. The critical word in that last sentence is one. You retain a single sucker and develop it deliberately, not two or three or all of them. The discipline of the single stem method is not abandoned here. It is simply applied to two stems instead of one, and all other suckers on both stems continue to be removed as they appear. The second exception is what experienced growers in hot climate regions sometimes call the Texas two-step, and it applies specifically to gardeners dealing with the kind of intense, direct summer sun common in places like Texas, the American Southwest, and inland California. In these environments, a completely naked single stem with no leaf cover around the developing fruit clusters creates a specific and very real problem called sun scald. When ripening tomatoes are fully exposed to direct, intense midday sun for extended periods, the skin on the side facing the sun bleaches out, develops pale or white blistered patches, and essentially cooks before the fruit is ready to harvest. The solution, counterintuitively, is to allow some suckers to develop just enough to create a few leaves that act as a natural shade canopy over the ripening fruit clusters, and then to pinch out the growing tip of those suckers once they have produced that protective leaf cover, preventing them from developing further into full secondary stems. The sucker is not removed entirely. It is allowed to grow into a miniature umbrella of shade leaves and then stopped before it becomes a competing structural stem. If you are gardening in a cool or temperate climate, you will likely never need this technique. If you are dealing with 90-degree summer days and a sun that feels like a heat lamp, it is worth understanding. By the time your indeterminate tomato plant has grown to knee height and above, and the first clusters of small green fruit are beginning to set on the vine, it is time to address a separate but equally important management task that most backyard guides mention only briefly or skip over entirely. This is the clearance of the lower canopy, and it is one of the most effective disease prevention steps available to any tomato grower. Here is the problem it solves. The majority of the most destructive tomato diseases, including early blight, late blight, and septoria leaf spot, do not originate on the plant itself. They originate in the soil. The fungal spores that cause these diseases live in the top layer of garden soil, sometimes persisting there for multiple seasons, waiting for the right conditions to infect a new plant. The delivery mechanism is water. When rain falls or when you run a sprinkler or hand water from above, individual water droplets hit the soil surface and bounce back upward, carrying soil particles and the fungal spores clinging to those particles with them. These splash droplets travel upward typically 12 to 18 inches before gravity stops them, which is exactly the range occupied by the lowest hanging leaves on a mature tomato plant. Those leaves catch the spore-laden droplets, infection takes hold, and within days you begin seeing the yellowing, dark spotting, or lesions that signal a fungal disease working its way through your crop. The fix is straightforward and requires nothing more than a clean pair of shears and 10 minutes of your time. Once your plant is established and growing strongly, remove all the leaf branches from the bottom 12 to 18 inches of the main stem. The goal is a completely bare lower stem with an open gap of air between the soil surface and the first leaves of the plant. This bare zone does two things simultaneously. First, it physically eliminates the leaf surface that soil splash droplets would otherwise land on and infect, removing the easiest entry point for soil-borne fungal disease. Second, it creates a channel of open airflow at the base of the plant, essentially turning the bottom of your tomato bed into a wind tunnel that keeps the surrounding foliage dry and prevents the humid, stagnant air conditions that allow powdery mildew to develop on the upper leaves. By the way, if you're looking to completely transform your yard into a low-maintenance paradise, don't forget that my full reference guide, The Plant Once Garden, is now officially available. It's 150 pages covering all the perennial foundations and permanent setups we talk about on this channel. You can scan the QR code right here on the screen, or find the link in the pinned comment below to grab your copy. Now, let's move on. Even with disciplined pruning and clean lower canopy management, your tomato plants are going to face environmental threats across the growing season, and having a clear, systematic response for each of them is the difference between catching a problem early and watching a healthy plant collapse within 2 weeks. There are 4 major categories of threat worth knowing how to handle specifically. The first is fungal disease. If you are walking through your garden and you see yellowing patches spreading across leaves, dark spots with yellowed halos, or a white powdery coating developing on the leaf surface, you are looking at a fungal infection in progress, and you need to act the same day you see it. The organic treatment that works reliably on surface fungal growth is diluted hydrogen peroxide, the standard 3% concentration sold at any pharmacy or grocery store. Mix 1 part hydrogen peroxide with 8 parts clean water in a spray bottle and apply it as a fine mist covering both the top and underside of every affected leaf. The mild acidity and oxidizing action of the diluted peroxide kills surface fungal cells on contact without bleaching or burning the leaf tissue itself. This is not a cure for fungal disease that has already penetrated deep into leaf tissue, but applied early and consistently when you first spot symptoms, it halts surface spore activity and slows or stops the spread significantly. The second threat, and the one that tends to cause the most dramatic overnight damage, is the tomato hornworm. If you have grown tomatoes for more than a season or 2, you have almost certainly experienced the hornworm without ever seeing the culprit. These are large, thick, green caterpillars that can reach the size of your index finger, and they are so perfectly camouflaged against tomato foliage that they are nearly impossible to spot in daylight, even when you are specifically looking for them. What they are capable of in a single night of feeding is genuinely startling. A mature hornworm can strip significant sections of a healthy plant's foliage by morning, and a handful of them feeding simultaneously can leave you with bare stems overnight. The trick for finding them reliably is to go into the garden after dark with a UV blacklight flashlight. Natural proteins in the hornworm's skin cause it to fluoresce a vivid, unmistakable neon green under ultraviolet light, making animals that are invisible to the naked eye in daylight suddenly glow like small lanterns against the dark foliage. Pick them off by hand and dispose of them. For widespread caterpillar infestations where hand-picking is not practical, the correct organic treatment is Bacillus thuringiensis, commonly sold under the abbreviation BT. This is a naturally occurring soil bacterium that produces proteins toxic to the digestive systems of leaf-eating caterpillars when they ingest plant material that has been treated with it. The critical advantage of BT over conventional insecticide is its specificity. It targets only caterpillars actively feeding on treated plant tissue and is completely harmless to honeybees, ladybugs, predatory wasps, and every other beneficial insect in your garden. Spray it on the foliage when you are dealing with a hornworm or armyworm problem, reapply after rain, and continue until the infestation clears. The fourth category of threat is one that many gardeners do not expect until it has already cost them part of their harvest: rodents. As tomatoes ripen and their sugar content climbs, they become highly attractive to rats and mice, which can smell the sweetness from a surprising distance. If you are finding partially eaten tomatoes hanging on the vine, the damage is typically at night, and you will almost never catch the animal in the act. Set secure mechanical traps along the perimeter of the garden bed at dusk and check them in the morning. Address the problem immediately when it appears. A single rat that has discovered a reliable food source will return every night until the food is gone or the source is eliminated. Here is the technique that consistently surprises people. Not because it is complicated or expensive, but because the ingredient involved is something that has been sitting in your medicine cabinet for years, and you had no idea it had any relationship to plant health whatsoever. Plain, uncoated, standard-strength aspirin tablets, acetyl salicylic acid, are one of the most effective immune system boosters available to a backyard tomato grower, and the science behind why it works is genuinely interesting. When a tomato plant is attacked by a pathogen or a feeding pest in nature, its internal defense system responds by releasing a localized chemical hormone called salicylic acid. This hormone travels through the plant's vascular system and triggers what botanists call systemic acquired resistance, or SAR, a whole plant immune response in which cell walls are strengthened, defense enzymes are activated, and the plant essentially puts itself on high alert against further infection or attack. Think of it as the plant's version of an immune response after encountering a threat. The system activates, defenses go up, and the plant becomes measurably more resistant to subsequent infection for a period of time afterward. Here is the practical implication of that biology. Aspirin is acetyl salicylic acid, which converts to salicylic acid when metabolized. By dissolving aspirin in water and applying it to your tomato plants, you are delivering the same chemical signal that the plant's own immune system releases under attack, which means you are triggering SAR in a perfectly healthy plant before any threat has appeared. The plant's immune system activates and goes on alert even though there is nothing to fight yet, which means that when an actual fungal spore lands on a leaf or a caterpillar takes its first bite, the plant's defenses are already primed and respond faster and more effectively than they would in an untreated plant. The practical benefits of this are threefold. First, treated plants show measurably increased resistance to blight, wilt diseases, and viral infections across the season. Second, aspirin solution applied to transplants at the time of planting significantly reduces transplant shock, helping young seedlings establish faster and with less visible stress. Third, and this is the one that gets the most attention in the comments, the metabolic shift that SAR triggers causes the plant to allocate more energy toward fruit development and specifically toward sugar synthesis in the developing fruit, which translates into tomatoes that are noticeably sweeter and more flavorful at harvest compared to untreated plants growing side by side. The formula is simple. Dissolve 1 standard uncoated aspirin tablet completely in 1 gallon of water. Use this solution as a root drench poured around the base of the plant, or apply it as a fine foliar spray across the leaves, periodically throughout the growing season, rather than as a single one-time treatment. All of the pruning discipline, disease prevention, and immune system management in this guide will not save a tomato plant from the consequences of erratic watering, and this is the final piece of the system worth understanding precisely. Tomatoes are unusually sensitive to moisture fluctuation compared to most garden vegetables, and the consequences of uneven watering show up not in the leaves, but in the fruit itself. The two most common structural defects caused by inconsistent moisture are skin splitting and blossom end rot. Skin splitting happens when a plant is allowed to dry out significantly and then receives a large amount of water all at once. The internal flesh of the tomato, which is essentially composed of water-filled cells, absorbs the sudden influx of moisture rapidly and expands faster than the outer skin can stretch to accommodate the growth. The skin tears open, sometimes dramatically, ruining fruit that was days away from a perfect harvest. Blossom end rot, the dark, sunken, leathery patch that appears on the bottom of developing tomatoes, is driven by calcium deficiency, caused not by a lack of calcium in the soil, but by the plant's inability to absorb calcium consistently when moisture levels fluctuate too widely for the root system to function at a steady rate. The solution is not a specific watering volume. It is a specific watering rhythm. You want the soil in your tomato bed to maintain a consistent moisture level, described best as the texture of a wrung-out sponge. Not waterlogged, not dry, consistently damp at a depth that keeps the root zone continuously supplied without ever allowing it to cycle between drought and flood. Deep, infrequent watering that penetrates well below the soil surface is preferable to frequent shallow watering that wets only the top few inches, because deep moisture reserves fluctuate more slowly than surface moisture and give the root system a more consistent supply between watering sessions. A practical way to check whether your watering is reaching adequate depth is to push a wooden skewer or a thin stake into the soil about 6 inches down and pull it out afterward. If the stick comes out with moist soil clinging to it uniformly from the tip to about 4 inches up, your water is penetrating properly. If the stick is dry at the tip and only wet in the top inch or two, you are watering at the surface, and the roots are chasing moisture that dries out quickly between sessions. Drip irrigation set to run for a longer duration less frequently, or hand watering with deliberate slow soaking at the base of the plant rather than quick splashing. Both address this. Mulching the soil surface with 2 to 3 inches of straw, wood chips, or shredded leaves dramatically slows surface evaporation and keeps the underlying moisture more stable between watering events, and it is one of the simplest high-impact improvements any tomato grower can make. Finally, pair your single stem management and consistent watering with appropriate physical support for the vertical structure you are building. A tomato plant trained up a single main stem and loaded with heavy fruit clusters is carrying significant weight on a structure not much thicker than a garden hose, and it will need help staying upright as the harvest develops. An 8-foot stake driven firmly into the soil at planting time, with the stem attached to it as it grows using plastic plant clips or soft garden tape, is the simplest and most reliable approach. Overhead twine systems, where individual lengths of twine are attached to a horizontal rail above the bed and wound around the growing stem as it climbs, work beautifully in a greenhouse or covered growing structure. The specific support method matters less than the consistency of using it. A single stem plant that tips over or snaps under its own weight in August will undo everything you did right across the entire season. This is the complete system. 2 tomato plants in a 3-foot wide bed, trained vertically, pruned weekly, protected against disease and pests with hydrogen peroxide, Bt, and aspirin, watered consistently and supported as they climb. And from that small, tightly managed footprint, you will harvest more tomatoes than most gardeners pull from a bed 3 times the size and 10 times the chaos. I want to be honest about what to expect in your first season applying this method, because the learning curve is real, and knowing what is coming makes it easier to push through. The first 2 or 3 weeks of sucker removal will feel tedious and slightly nerve-wracking. You will second-guess whether you are removing the right thing. Your pruned plant will look severe and almost spare compared to the lush, untouched plants in your neighbor's garden, and some part of your brain will tell you that something is wrong. Do not let it. That spare, trained plant is doing exactly what you want it to do, and the difference between it and the unpruned neighbor will be fully evident by August, when your managed plant is hanging with heavy fruit clusters and your neighbor's plant is a beautiful green wall that produced 40 tomatoes all season. The discipline required to trust the method through the early, seemingly harsh stages is genuinely the hardest part of learning this system, and it gets significantly easier once you have seen the harvest result with your own eyes at least once. If you are going to try this in your garden this season, I genuinely want to hear how it goes. Drop a comment below telling me which variety you are growing and how the single stem experiment works out for you, because I read every comment on these videos, and your real-world results shape what I cover in future ones. If this was useful, subscribe to Garden Roots for more honest, experience-based growing guides built for people who want to understand why the method works, not just follow the steps. If you are ready to stop losing plants every winter and finally build a garden that takes care of itself, grab your copy of The Plant Once Garden, 150 pages of everything this channel teaches, mapped out for you. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link in the description to get started. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today, and I will see you in the next one.